I'm going to introduce session 21, which will start on the hour. We've got Mirjana Budimir and Izzy Nelder talking from Practical Action in the next session. And they're talking about experiences from the SHEA project, especially landslip and the research they've done with that. I'd just like to remind everybody that the remaining sessions, there's only a couple now, but you can find them on the LandAware web pages, and I'll also post them back in the chat again. And we'll also post the link back to the Working Group 3 communications questionnaire for those of you who either were in the session yesterday or just want to feedback to us some of your interesting thoughts about communications with stakeholders, especially after listening to Mirjana and Izzy talk. So we're on this hour now, Mirjana and Izzy, and I'd very much like to welcome you and to begin your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Katie. Just bear with me 1 second whilst I share my screen. Can everybody see that?
Yes, we can, hopefully.
Can you see it as a slideshow?
Yes, we can see it as a slideshow. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So thank you for that welcome, Katie. It's really great to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone around the world. This session, we're going to be talking about communication and stakeholder engagement, specifically for landside early warning systems. We'll be bringing in our expertise from across wider work that we do on early warning systems through Practical Action. I'll be presenting with my colleague Izzy Nelder. So let's get started because there's quite a lot to discuss. So the session, what we're going to be doing is kind of going through some of the challenges and some lessons around stakeholder engagement and communication. It will then allow a bit of time for everyone else to kind of share their experiences, any challenges that you're experiencing, and any strategies that you're using to deal with some of those challenges, and then allow some time for Q&A and discussion. So when we're talking about early warning systems, we're really thinking about kind of this more of a holistic system. I've put in there the UNDRR and WMO's kind of categories around what an early warning system looks like. And it's really thinking about when we're talking about communication, it's a key component and it's really needed to make an early warning system effective to get the right information to the right people with enough time to take action. And really stakeholder engagement occurs across kind of all components. There's many stakeholders involved in an early warning system, and so that kind of communication across stakeholders is super important to make sure that they're really effective. Just a kind of a little bit of a note on scale in terms of a local or a regional landside early warning system. The scale really affects who the stakeholders are and how you disseminate or communicate warnings. And just to kind of a caveat on all of this, there's a lot more detail we could go into, but this is kind of beginning the conversation around some of the issues and some of the ways of dealing with it, some of the lessons from the wider literature and landslide case studies, but mostly it's very context specific. So we're going to hopefully extract some general learnings, but just bear in mind that case by case, the way that you engage with stakeholders, who you engage with, and how you communicate will differ. So I'm just going to hand over to my colleague Izzy.
Yes, thank you, Mirjana. Yeah, so I'm just going to give a very quick overview of stakeholder engagement, and I'll try to cover some of who the key stakeholders might be, some of the key challenges to effective stakeholder engagement, and then also, like Mirjana said, try and give some kind of general best practice from other early warning systems. So you can see here a very top level example of the types of stakeholders we would normally expect to see in a landslide early warning system. And as Mirjana said, this varies a lot from context to context and would be dependent on the scale and who's actually issuing the forecasts. Put really, really simply, a stakeholder is just someone you would expect to be working with, someone who has some stake or a role in the early warning system. And you can see here that we've tried to split this into upstream partners and downstream stakeholders. Excuse me. So the upstream stakeholders are those who provide the data. The partners are those we would work closely with to develop the forecasts or actually issue the warnings themselves. And downstream stakeholders are those who receive the warning information. And just to note on this slide, you can see a vertical line between the partners and downstream stakeholders, and that's just kind of meant to signify on the right, there's the local stakeholders, and on the left, these are the more regional. But this is obviously very context specific, and it's not a clear-cut line, and there's a lot of movement between the two. But yeah, what this really highlights, I think, is that stakeholders aren't simply disaster risk managers, forecasters, or early warning system departments, but it's really across society and includes the public, media, responders. And hence the importance of being able to engage with all of those stakeholders becomes, I think, really clear. Next slide, please, Mariana. So there are a number of challenges when it comes to stakeholder engagement in early warning systems, but specifically landslide early warning systems. And one of which is when to actually engage with stakeholders and how to actually go about doing this. There's often a lot of concern about what to say, when to say it, and how to talk about what you might be able to offer when you yourself might not be fully clear on what you're able to offer yet. And there can be pressure to be seen to be doing something before you're ready. And whilst it can be really challenging to talk about something before it's been really rigorously tested, these early conversations are really needed to manage expectations from the get-go. The next slide has some more general guidance, but in short, the earlier you can start this engagement, the better. Not only for managing expectations, but also to really ensure that the end product is something that's useful and really meets a need. And it's also important to recognise that engagement varies over time and will vary depending on who you're engaging with. So there's also a gap between what science can actually provide and what people need or want. For example, in resolution of forecasts, the lead time or accuracy. And we obviously know science is improving, but there's only so much it can do at the moment, especially regarding, for example, uncertainty. So when you combine this with the fact that users have a lot of needs, this, I think, can feel like a really overwhelming gap. But yeah, as I've already said, I just want to highlight here that this early stakeholder engagement really allows us to start to close that gap a little bit and just create a better understanding on both sides of what's possible and what's needed. So when talking about stakeholders, there are specific barriers depending on which stakeholder we're referring to. So you can see here from the user's perspective, information can often be a bit too technical. And I think often we fall into the trap of forgetting that scientists use a very different, more technical language. This difference in language is probably more pronounced with the public, but can be still really quite obvious even with educated or institutional users who just don't have that specific specialism. It's also really, really important just to acknowledge that users are dealing with hazards on a daily basis, and the sooner we can provide them with the useful information, the better. But this whole process can sometimes feel really rushed. And as I've just said, because people are dealing with hazards on a daily basis, it can be quite a tense exchange of information or tense relationship, because you might actually only be offering a solution to one of their problems or one of their needs, and you might not even be able to fully meet one problem or one need. And so this kind of leads me on to the next point, which is about the perceived relevance of a forecast, particularly in the early phase when the level of information might differ significantly from what the users actually want to be able to make a decision. So it's just important to remember that users, as I've already said, deal with lots of different types of risks, disasters, and actually pressures, and we just need to be really aware and conscious of this. So again, we can see here that the importance of stakeholder engagement, where the earlier we can engage and understand what those needs, pressures, and capacities are, the better. And yes, so from a forecaster's perspective, a key challenge is actually engaging with stakeholders and communicating the forecast itself, not simply just producing a really skillful forecast. And I think naturally this can be outside of some people's comfort zones. The skill sets within a forecasting team are mainly physical science and may lack more the social science communication skill sets needed to really build an effective early warning system. And so some of these skills can be outsourced, but it's just important to recognise that stakeholder engagement is a key element of an early warning system and not just an add-on. As we've said, forecasting, monitoring and warning are obviously key components in an overall system, but they are exactly that. They are a component, and we really need to focus on each element informing each other. The next slide, please, Mariana. So how do other landslide early warning systems engage with stakeholders? So kind of keeping those challenges that I've just spoken about in mind, and based on our experiences, the following are kind of just a few ways in which landslide early warning systems normally engage with stakeholders. So the first point there is that landslide early warning systems tend to build on existing disaster risk management or early warning system frameworks within a specific country context. And by doing this, it really means that we're not reinventing the wheel, and we're kind of capitalizing on existing behaviors or processes. And that's really useful in being able to integrate within existing roles, mandates and actual activities. It's also likely that formal institutional arrangements will already be in place, and these will be really needed horizontally and vertically, kind of for data sharing, acting on communications and participating in training. So beyond those existing frameworks, most landslide early warning systems are integrated within regular DRM activities. So for example, in pre-monsoon workshops and post-monsoon debrief sessions. And stakeholder engagement can be integrated into these disaster risk management activities and build on who is already participating. And actually in doing that sort of engagement at that point in time, you might be able to identify who else needs to participate and where there might be gaps in participation. And yeah, these activities can be done via workshops, training through email, but as I think we've all seen through COVID-19, it probably is good to keep an awareness that face-to-face interaction can't really be replaced, and it's really, really effective for building those relationships, communicating effectively, especially when you're trying to deal with quite significant problems or challenges. So yeah, I just want to highlight that to really not forget the importance of face-to-face. So the next point is that within a landslide early warning system, there are you'll work with to issue the forecast. And this sort of engagement really helps form a shared vision of what the early warning system will look like. And that, yeah, this kind of more informal relationship really helps develop transparency and trust in the forecasts. And that's just really, really important and can be built up over time. And whilst it should be built up over time, we do actively encourage that it start as soon as possible. And there's just a note there on the bottom, just that pilot landslide early warning systems will engage with stakeholders slightly differently to how operational systems will. In these pilot phases, we'll still be testing things out and actually building these relationships and probably prioritising education and outreach. And we'll also be kind of like trialling new methods on how to actually establish the operational system. And this is a really intense period with loads and loads of stakeholders involved. Whereas in the operational phase, this stakeholder engagement continues, but it's kind of already built into a regular process and is more of a tweaking of the existing system or processes. So just to highlight that engagement never ends, it's not something that's just done, it continues throughout the entire process of setting up and then running the early warning system. So the next slide, please, Mariana. So I'll just end my little section now with some kind of general guidance from the wider early warning system field, but also we'll also pull on some landslide early warning projects that hopefully will guide your own systems. So as I've tried to highlight throughout, It's not a one-off task that you simply do at the beginning of a project. It's meant to be a very iterative process with a lot of feedback. It requires forecasters to be involved, again, throughout the entire process. It's not just meeting someone at the beginning and you've formed that relationship. It is continuous and needs to be on a regular basis. And it's also really important from the offset to try and spend the time getting to understand the context. And by doing this, you'll gain a better understanding of the needs and capacities, the existing formal and informal structures that we've just spoken about, as well as the current communication activities that are going on. And then with all of this information, you can actually develop an early warning system that is really useful and meets the needs of the people you want it to. And this is effectively user-centered design, and this is absolutely essential for early warning systems. You just need to talk to people involved to know what their needs are and go back and forth to really figure out what's possible and how this early warning system can work. So yeah, the third bullet point is about the fact that stakeholders are really partners. They're not someone who we add on down the line, and we really need to work together to co-produce and develop this shared vision. And by doing so, it just means it will increase the longevity and sustainability of the early warning system, as it can actually be carried on past the life cycle of the project, for example. Yeah, and stakeholder engagement from the offset really allows you to be more transparent about what you do know, what you don't know, and what is possible. And this kind of managing of expectations is just critical. And this also relates to building trust. So when a warning is issued, the end users trust you because they've been involved from the beginning, and they actually will act on the information given to them. And so within the team that issues the forecasts and warnings, we do need a range of skills beyond just the forecasting and physical sciences. We'll need skills more related to communication. And this, as I've said, can be either in the team or it can be brought into the team. And quite an effective way of doing this is using an intermediary that might be within the context where you are, and that can obviously bring a lot more insight into the specific context. So yeah, developing these relationships and trust and building the early warning system are obviously very challenging tasks, but stakeholder engagement is absolutely essential to building this early warning system. And it's just important to know that it just takes time, it's iterative, but it is worth it, because it's only through that sort of engagement that you can then have an early warning system that provides the right information to the right people and in the right way, so they can actually take action in advance of landslides. So thank you. I think that's my section done.
Thank you, Izzy. That was really good. Okay, so now on to a conversation around communication. I've added in here and dissemination. So just to divide up, dissemination is really thinking about how information gets to people, and communication is more about what's in that when it gets to them. So what does kind of dissemination look like for landside early warning systems? So you can see here, kind of try to divide up some existing examples of how warning information is issued and who is issued to. We've got kind of key responders. So these are people whose really it's their job to do something about this. They particularly take action, whether that's further communicating that down to another group or to the public. Or whether that's kind of taking actions such as, closing schools or closing roads or preparing to respond earlier after a potential landslide. You can see there's different methods in terms of the regional or local scale. So I'm not going to talk through all of this in detail. You can kind of have a bit of a scan over, but the types of ways of getting information to different groups varies. So the way that you would send a communication to a key responder will be different to the public. There is some overlaps, often kind of having a website or a platform that people can have access to, or an app. Those are kind of similar platforms. And obviously all the key responders can access anything that's available to the public. But they kind of vary in terms of kind of tendencies for websites, bulletins, reports, SMS or app alerts. press releases are used typically for the media, and then for the public, a lot of it is around social media and via the media such as TV or radio, or via local government dissemination channels. At the local level, it's slightly different. So sometimes you'll have a siren or a flashing light or an SMS that's specifically to someone who's identified as a key responder in the community. And sometimes they then communicate that further manually to the wider public. Sometimes this is in parallel with communication methods that go directly to the public, such as sirens or loudspeakers or app alerts, or often in-person, kind of literally door-to-door communication, particularly in remote communities in developing countries. So what does it look like in terms of the communication? So this looks quite different from local to regional, and really depends on the user. Often it's kind of what are called bulletins or kind of reports that are issued that have kind of color-coded warning levels, text, often kind of having language around the likelihood of occurrence, percentages, an explanation of like what the maps are actually saying, maybe a little bit more detail drilling down into specific areas that might be at higher risk than others. Sometimes there's advice, but not always. And then sometimes in terms of there's verbal or SMS sent to the public or through local systems. It's often kind of short messages, sometimes with actions to follow up. So what are the challenges and barriers? So there's a lot of challenges with communicating. I could spend hours just on this one slide, so I'm going to just kind of quickly go through some of the challenges so we can begin that conversation. We can follow up that later. So broadly speaking, often the challenges are around accessibility, understanding, usefulness, and the content that goes into those communications. So accessibility, this is more of an issue, particularly for the public users. So it's thinking about when you're sending out that warning message, is everyone actually receiving it? Do they have access to that channel of communication that you're using? There's particularly in developing countries, there's a digital divide in access to technologies. So if you're using, for example, an app or an SMS, that's assuming that everybody has access to a mobile phone or access to a smartphone. And that's not necessarily the case, particularly in developing countries. Social inequality really affects the way that people can access information, and it affects the way that they have preferences for information. So for example, it might be that they don't have access to a smartphone, but actually they have a radio and they listen to the radio on a regular basis, and that's where they get their information from. We also kind of have to think beyond the general public and think further down into the kind of the layers of what does that mean in terms of people on the ground, and particularly thinking about those who are more marginalized and who are most vulnerable to these disasters. Do they have access to it? So for example, do they have a disability that might affect their ability to see or to hear? And if you're relying on one method of communication, for example, a siren, those who have auditory hearing issues will therefore not have access to that warning information. It's kind of thinking around not everyone has equal access to the warning messages that you're sending out. Then there's thinking about kind of understanding. So even if that message gets to someone, the way that you're presenting the information, is it understandable? So again, we reflect back, technical jargon is a big issue in terms of trying to translate that quite complicated scientific information to something that's actually useful for people who are using it. And this means, you know, for the public, there'll be a wide variety of educational backgrounds. There might potentially be literacy barriers to being able to read or understand that sort of information. It's also thinking about, are you communicating in the language? So often warning information is issued in the dominant language of a country, but there are often other languages spoken within that country. And so how are you catering for those people who don't speak that main language or are not as familiar or comfortable speaking that main language? And this even still applies in terms of that scientific information, that jargon applies to people who are receiving it in potentially more institutional roles. So they are more likely, for example, disaster risk managers, NGO responders, etc., etc. They are likely to be educated or have a certain level of education, but they don't necessarily have that background of science that you will be having as forecasters issuing that information. And again, echoing Issy, we forget how much you change the way you speak, because the language that you use when you're talking about forecasting and physical science is very much a different language to the general population out there. So realizing that and trying to incorporate that into the way that you frame your information is really, really helpful. Dealing with uncertainty, again, this is a hot topic in terms of whether you include uncertainty information or whether you don't include uncertainty information. And if you are including uncertainty information, how do you present that? How do you communicate that? That's a continual issue that doesn't really have a one solution, but it's constantly kind of something that needs to be considered when communicating this warning information. And then thinking about kind of usefulness. So there's often kind of again, we've said before, a need versus the science kind of mismatch, and the usefulness of the warning information that you provide will really vary based on the type of early warning system that you're doing. So for example, the local landslide early warning system will not be really applicable to the next village over. It's only really looking at that particular slope. The level of granularity and detail that you'll be able to provide for regional early warning systems is often sometimes a big gap in terms of what people are trying to take actions based on. And then the lead time will really vary between the two. So you can often get a longer lead time for regional early warning, whereas a local one, the lead time is often quite short. So realizing that they're going to be kind of gaps in how you communicate that and what's useful to those who are using them is a challenge. And then thinking about content, whether to provide advice alongside the warning information and whether that advice is useful and appropriate to specific users, and whether that's your role in providing advice to take action. And then also thinking about impact-based forecasting. So this is obviously the kind of the gold standard of warnings, but it's quite advanced to do. Are you ready to provide that sort of information to your users? So some just kind of general principles, guidance, some considerations to be thinking about when you're designing your communication and dissemination channels for early warning, particularly for landslides. Multiple dissemination channels. It's always better to have redundancies. It's always better to have multiple ways that information can get to people. And then thinking about, of your users, are you tailoring that information? Are you making sure that, for example, the information that goes to a disaster risk manager at a local level is the appropriate type of information compared to, for example, the general public? If you're communicating to, for example, the railway services, that's a different type of information that they will require. Making sure that the way that you're communicating is tailored for those specific users, and it will vary across those users. And then when you're communicating this, the clarity of the content. So we can kind of use the 7 principles of universal design, which I've included there, you can have a look at. But it's thinking about things like I said, language. Is it in the language that they speak and they're familiar with and they're comfortable with? Is it dealing with literacy issues? So we're using maybe visualizations as alongside text to try and kind of cover different methods of communicating the information. Thinking about those sensory impairments around audio-visual issues. And again, multiple dissemination channels can really, really help there. And then again, trying to exclude technical jargon so that you're communicating in the language that the user speaks rather than the language that you speak. And the way that you really do this, and the most beneficial, most effective early warning systems, are really that you need to work with users to be able to do this. You can do this on your own, but also you can do this via intermediaries or with intermediaries who might have those particular relationships with those users, or might be more skilled or more experienced in that type of communication side of things. But you still need to be involved in that, because you have the science and the knowledge to be able to make sure that communication is actually linked back to the science that you're trying to convey. And then you need to work with the users to think about, to check that, are they accessing it? Are there any barriers? Can you change the way that you communicate or disseminate your information so that more people are able to access, or everyone is able to access that information? Check that it's understandable, check that they do actually understand what it means, and potentially the uncertainties and the limitations of the forecast that you're providing to them. Is it useful? Is there a way that you can potentially, you might need to change it so that, or accompany it with other information, maybe potentially partnering with other stakeholders to have kind of add-on information that can really be useful for their specific needs. And then lastly, is it actionable? Can they actually take this information and do something about it, and really think about what can they do before a potential landslide rather than after a landslide? And is that information the right sort of information they can have? Thinking about kind of, is it truly reaching the last, I said the first mile here. So this is thinking about, we often talk about reaching the last mile, so every single person within a community or every single person in the public. They've previously been called the last mile, but more often these days they're called the first mile, because they're the people that you should be going to first to develop the communication strategy, to develop the early warning system. So thinking about them more as the first mile rather than as kind of the last thought in the process of communicating. And then again, considering kind of those marginalized groups, women, children, elderly, people with disabilities, people experiencing homelessness, people who are experiencing discrimination based on their gender identity or their sexuality or their ethnicity, their race, and their religion, and various other marginalization that can come into this. This really, I can't go a huge amount into detail at the moment, but this really affects the way that people have access to and capacities to take action on early warning information. Again, as Izzy mentioned, including this kind of the experience and the skills and the expertise to think about this communication within your forecasting team, or outsource it, or work with an intermediary who does this a lot. This is there's a whole host of things that come on with this. We've kind of rapidly gone through this, but again, this is a big speciality that, you know, if you can have someone within your team or someone that you work with to think about this, who has that kind of level of knowledge, this can really help to develop a system that is truly kind of getting the right information all the way down to the people, and making sure that they are integrated within that system. And then thinking about kind of building in those feedback mechanisms, so checking that they are receiving that information, they do understand it, they can take action, and building that into a regular system, either within kind of your regular pre-monitoring, post-monitoring workshops, but also feedback buttons on apps, mobile phone numbers that people can ring, access to a website where people can send information, potentially working with intermediaries who go into the communities on a regular basis to kind of get them to check whether they're using that information and have access to it and there's no barriers there, and really listening to what they're saying so that you can adapt your methods continually. And this is, again, as he said, it's not a one-off, this is continuous, continually iteratively, because things change. And while, you know, the forecasting science might improve or develop or change, but also the people on the ground, what they're experiencing, their capacities, who's living there, etc., that will change as well. So adapting the system continually is really necessary, and really listening and taking on board the people who you're trying to get this information to, and placing them at the center of how you design your communication strategy, your dissemination strategy. And the only way of doing that really is engaging with those stakeholders. So that was a bit of a very rapid tour of stakeholder engagement and communication. What I'd really like to spend a bit of time now, I welcome questions as well, but really would like to encourage and ask people if you have any experiences with stakeholder engagement or communication dissemination, and what do you do? What are your challenges that you experience? Do you have any solutions? And just kind of begin that conversation as a group. And I'll just stop sharing my screen. Jo, you've got your hand up.
Hi, Mariana. Thanks for a great talk. I didn't really want to be the first, but that's okay. So my questions actually it's related to your point about vulnerable people. So these people are often, as you said, the most marginalized in society and are frequently not brought to the table. So if you go through a standard sort of hierarchical approach for how you would engage potentially, they wouldn't be invited to have a voice necessarily. I wondered if you had any advice on how to tap into those vulnerable groups to be able to get their perspectives.
Yeah, definitely. No, this is a big challenge, and again, I think it's something that is continually being explored. You're right. Even in kind of traditional methods of, you know, holding focus group discussions or running surveys and things like that, even if you're trying to get a variety of people's perspectives, for example, in focus group discussions, if there is an equal number of women to men in a group, that doesn't necessarily mean that those women are feeling empowered enough to participate in the conversation, or whether their voices are actually being heard. So there are alternative methods of doing this. We've just been trialing a new method, which we're calling the missing voices approach. And this is really about identifying groups of people or identities within a community in a particular context who are the most marginalized. So going beyond just thinking about women and children, thinking about, for example, widows, or people with a physical disability, or the LGBTQ community, or, you know, thinking about and whether there's kind of multiple vulnerabilities that are within one identity. And what we've been talking about and thinking about and working on is working with intermediaries, working with trusted people who work with those most marginalized. So not trying to suggest that we, as the scientists or whatever, go into the communities and visibly try and work one-to-one with people that we've never met before. But working with those intermediary organisations is often civil society, NGOs that work either locally or at an international level, who have access to and have worked with those people on a regular basis. So going to those intermediaries and getting them to access those most marginalised people and hear from them. So another method that we're putting on this is, instead of going into the community, accessing them by mobile phone, getting a mobile phone to them so that they can arrange a time and place where they feel comfortable and safe kind of sharing their experiences and not being overheard or not being perceived as being singled out in a community, which is, again, we don't want to cause more harm going into a community and saying we're specifically only speaking to this person within your village. So allowing that kind of that freedom of speech over the mobile phone. And really another method is just, or what the approach is, listening to them. So asking our questions rather than kind of a tick box kind of structured interview. It's about kind of prompting them to kind of say in their own words what their experiences are and what their barriers are, and allowing them that freedom of having their own voice, and then taking that information back and thinking about what does that mean for the way that we communicate. Can we change anything? And using those kind of first person experiences to design how we do things.
That's great.
Thanks. Anyone else got any questions or wants to, share their experiences?
Miliana,
yes.
Miliana, it's Shaibal from India.
Hi, Saibal.
Fine. I have a small question for you that as you have also experienced along with us, that there are a lot of, you can say, hiccups or maybe some irregular feedbacks from the local authorities during the testing period. How can we make it more institutionalized or make it more regular? So that and what changes do you suggest that we should take up so that we can get a regular feedback during the experimental phase and also during the operational phase? Because without the proper feedback, it is extremely difficult to fine-tune the model, fine-tune the process. What is your suggestion?
Okay, thank you, Saibal. So just to give everyone a bit of a background, we're talking here about an experimental prototype landslide early warning system that is being trialled in India through the LandStick project with the Geological Survey of India. And this is being trialled in a kind of closed pilot phase. We've been trying to get feedback from the district managers who are responsible for receiving warning information and taking action on that. So I think there's a bit of kind of, so the way that we've tried to get feedback from them previously is through asking them to provide written feedback on a weekly basis, and then also doing a post-monsoon debrief session and a pre-monsoon preparedness session. The weekly kind of feedback has been not readily taken up. And in terms of the post-monsoon feedback session, there's been kind of limited open, transparent feedback and communication. So I think this is kind of two things I want to think about is going back to Izzy's point of realizing that people that we are communicating to have a lot of other things on their plates. And so this whilst this might be something that is hugely important to us, this is only kind of one of many things that they're dealing with at the time. And recognizing that potentially they may not be able to engage on a regular basis. This might improve over time as they see that the forecast information becomes potentially more accurate or more skillful or more relevant, and they see that that information is useful for them to make decisions. They will, as time goes on, become more engaged as those relationships between the forecasters, GSI, and those who are using it, the district managers, develop over time. That conversation will become less feeling like it's a formal requirement and more of a kind of informal, oh, well, I'm just communicating back to X person who I know and I've met and I've known for years. So this will likely improve over time. The regular kind of weekly feedback, that might need adjusting. We might need to kind of think about different ways of doing that, and that's fine. Kind of changing it so that it's more suitable for those users is absolutely fine. That's part of the evolving process. And again, the pre and the particularly post-monsoon workshops where we're asking for feedback. In some cultures, providing feedback that is potentially perceived as criticism is not encouraged and is something that feels very different to what they have been experiencing before. So this will potentially rely on a bit of a culture shift, and again, unfortunately, time and open conversations, open communications, and that, again, that relationship building of it's the same people going back and saying, we really want to hear, having maybe potentially more tailored questions, potentially doing feedback sessions one-to-one, which is more resource intensive, but really you can kind of dig down into people's experiences rather than doing it as a wider group. So there are different methods of doing this, but ultimately, because of the potential situation, because it's still in kind of the initial stages, it will take time. It will get better. It's just a little bit painful in the beginning. Welcome. Does anyone else have any questions or want to share their experiences? Graziella.
Yes. No, maybe I can share what we did. Actually, in this, because now this Norwegian warning is operating since 2013, and we did three survey during this time, mainly with the road authority and the railway authority, because are probably our main users first, and of course the municipality, and especially those people working with emergency response in the municipality, because we want to know that they take action when we send the warning. So, but these questionnaire were mainly, I'll say, mainly to evaluate our, so what they think about our system in general. And we see that there was an improvement. So they understood, we see in the answer that at the beginning, the landslide warning was not clear, understood. And of course, we're struggling always to have many answers from the municipality. This is, there are less people responding, even if we send to everybody. And are those that understand less our warning. They do not have a problem with the snow avalanche, because this is, of course, the snow avalanche is also mainly for tourists, or how say, for another kind of user, but they understand better because they are more experienced with snow avalanche, and they understand better flood because they have a longer experience. This landslide, rainfall induced landslide, they still have a problem, but we got positive feedback that we see that in these three surveys, in the last one, they understood better the necessity. And especially because in the last year, we have our regional office, because MVE has 5 regional office. So with the previous experience, we decided in the last years that each time we issue orange warning, they have to they take initiative themselves to telephone to call all the municipality and ask if they need some help, if everything is okay, if they have understood, and this helps really a lot. We did also another survey using telephone interview to see if they understood our warning messages. But and there is a report, but it's only Norwegian. And it was interesting that the one that got help from our regional office understood immediately. Or they were more comfortable in understanding what is written in the warning message. We were a bit unlucky that when we did this survey, we changed the way how we presented. So we sent them a first version of the warning. And during the questionnaire, so at the end of the project, we changed, and actually we got the feedback and we put in the so at the end maybe it was not valid, the results or what we obtained, and we were not expert in this kind of questionnaire. So I think but we want to do this at least every two years, so 2-3 years, just to see. Yeah.
It's really great to hear that you're
I can share this report. Of course, it's in Norwegian, but maybe it can help, so I can put in the chat.
That would be great. Thank you, Graziella. I think it's really great that you're specifically sourcing feedback and trying to get feedback from people. Surveys are useful ways of doing this to get from a wide variety of people. I wonder whether there's an opportunity or a missed opportunity that once COVID is over, in-person workshops or in-person events. Doesn't have to be super frequently, potentially maybe once a year. Is there an event that those particular groups are already attending that you can piggyback onto or attend yourselves to have kind of an informal conversation and get verbal feedback, discussion, again, kind of sharing across the users and those who are forecasting and having that conversation? I think in person would be really beneficial. You can see, like you said, that those who are regularly engaging over the phone with the regional officers have a better understanding. And again, that's building on those relationships and being able to have that regular point of contact. So potentially something you might want to think about is having a workshop session where you can refamiliarize people with what you're doing and what you're providing and how the communications channels work, and then actively seek responses, feedback, questions, and again, build those relationships. And yeah, like I say, whether that's piggybacking on existing practices or activities, or whether that's something that you might want to do yourselves and maybe partner with others who are also providing forecast information. I know that the flood and the avalanche early warning systems in Norway are kind of linked anyway, so that might be something interesting to pursue. Got maybe another 5 minutes left before we leave a little break for people before the next session. Has anyone else got anything to share or any questions or issues? Jo, go ahead.
Sorry, Mariana, another question. So it was related to Izzy's point in her part of the presentation around the longevity of engagement. And I, obviously, from a meteorological perspective, this is something that we've had quite a bit of experience with. I would say we're still not there. We still don't necessarily do that particularly well. But I'd be interested to know how people sort of design that long-term engagement strategy and how they keep the roles and responsibilities within that quite clear, because the turnover in a lot of the downstream stakeholder linkages changes so quickly that, you know, being able to retain the people who maybe have that knowledge move on, they move to different areas. So I just wondered whether there's anybody else who's had experiences of that sort of long-term engagement planning exercise and how they maintain that engagement.
Thanks, Jo. Maybe I'll start off with some suggestions and some answers from our experiences, and if anyone wants to chip in, please do so. So maybe just our example from Nepal of flood early warning systems. That long-term engagement is really built into existing disaster risk management kind of practices and policies. So it's already built within the wider kind of, for example, national strategy for disaster risk management. It's the mandates and responsibilities of who's responsible for issuing warning information is very clear. Who's responsible for taking action, responding is very clear. Often there's a bit of a gap between who's responsible for training, and this is where often NGOs, civil society organisations working with local disaster risk managers kind of comes into play, or local government authorities. And unfortunately, often this is built on people's willingness to engage rather than something that's built into the system itself. But the longer those sorts of activities go on and the benefits are really seen, the more it's kind of readily taken up and becomes almost like an informal policy or practice. So, for example, we in Nepal, there are pre and post monsoon workshops where there's training, there's kind of refresh of the information for both local government and responders and the public before the monsoon, and then there's a debrief session with those actors again at the end of the monsoon, and that's kind of a regularly built-in thing. And we've been talking about, you know, how do you build on that? If you had a landslide early warning system, it'd be very easy to just tag onto that existing system of that preparedness activities that go on a daily basis, integrating it with, for example, school programs and outreach and education. So yeah, so sometimes it's about probably not a concrete solution, but sometimes it's about building into existing practices, and sometimes it's seeing that there's a gap, and is there anyone else that can fill that gap, and are they going to be there for a long time? I think it really depends on the situation, and I think it will really vary from context to context. And I think it's even more difficult, for example, if you are, for example, the UK trying to support the developing country in those activities beyond the end of a project. How do you continue that engagement? I don't have a huge solution for you for that. Sorry, but there are other ways. You know, for example, I mean, LandAware is amazing. Now we've got a body of experts that people can tap into and get information from on potentially a regular basis or semi-regular basis, or at least we know where that expertise lies. Sorry, I've talked for quite some time. We've got about 5 minutes left, so perhaps we leave a little break before the next session.
That would be really good, Mariana, if you're happy to do that, because there wasn't one at the beginning of this one, so it'd be nice to just give everyone a couple of minutes. Thank you so much for your presentation, to both you and Izzy and everyone else for your questions. I think that was really interesting, and there's a lot of issues that, well, I've made notes on, but there's a lot of things that we all have to consider as the researchers, and it'd be good if people can contact you if they have any further questions.
I've just got can I share a slide so it's up in the background for the last 5 minutes? It's just,
of course you can, yes, yeah, instead of the holding slide.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, that's fine. So to everybody else, we'll start again at 10 o'clock, and it will be Hiro Nakai doing the Zoom hosting for that session and sharing that session. So if anybody wants to have a little break now and regather at the hour, then that will be great. Thank you ever so much.